David Miller, are you concerned that because anything can be published, there's no proper control over accuracy?
Well, no, not really. I mean, that is a problem with blogging. It's a problem with mainstream journalism. My own impression of the independent media on Iraq has been that they've been time and again more timious, more accurate, much better at gathering news than the mainstream media, who've been censored and refused to cover stuff and have been embedded and all that kind of thing. So I'm not concerned by that really at all. The issue is a wider one. It's an issue of our political context today. We live in a society where the media tend to think that the important sources that they should cover are those which exist in Parliament. And when you've got a society where Parliament has become increasingly divorced from the people, then that means that the media, because they concentrate on Parliament, are increasingly divorced from the people too. And there really is a huge anger in the country, as people throughout the land say on all these radical news sites and on anti-war demonstrations, about the way the government's behaved and about the way that the mainstream media have refused to properly cover them, and then when they've been caught out in lies, refused to apologise. There have been no apologies on the BBC for the lies that they told about the build-up in relation to Iraq, the nonsense about weapons of mass destruction, which was known by all these websites as being false by the end
As you know, we had an enormous row about that, which rumbled on for months and months and months, and I don't think I want to revisit it.
The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together, without coercion or conscription, bullying or bossiness.
Always whenever someone says, oh, peace and sausage, and it's a roll and sausage, and it's sausage roll, we're better together.
Well, they didn't. It was us. We invented it, just like every other bloody thing.
Well, that's very interesting.
We have very serious the referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, if you've been fed up with most of the debate until now, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland. Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast number 8, and I'm recording this exactly a month after I put out the first one, and I'm kind of surprised we've got to 8 episodes so quickly. But thanks to all of you for listening. That's been about 3,000 in the first month, so thank you. I was very happy to see the podcast in the middle of the new and noteworthy section on iTunes, although this particular episode might be considered not old, but recent and noteworthy, rather than new and noteworthy. This one is a little bit different. I actually recorded this interview about 3 years ago. So why is it relevant now, I can hear you ask? Well, because there's been a lot of controversy about the way the BBC have behaved in the run-up to this referendum, what their politics are. And this interview I recorded was specifically about the BBC and about basically what is their mission? What are the influences that can control them? Are they controlled? So I think taking a step back and looking at the organisation itself instead of just what they say on any given night, on Newsnight or on the news, seeing where that organisation comes from could help to place things in a bit of context. So this interview that I recorded about 3 years ago was with Professor David Miller, who at that time was at the University of Strathclyde. That was David Miller you heard in the introduction, making a fool of Jeremy Paxman actually. And as well as being a professor of sociology, he's also the author of Tell Me Lies, Propaganda and Media Distortion in the Attack on Iraq, and more recently, A Century of Spin, How Public Relations Became the Cutting Edge of Corporate Power. He's also one of the founders of spinwatch.org and of the more recent spinprofiles.org, both of which are very good websites that I suggest you check out. Okay, I'm with Professor David Miller and we're going to talk about the BBC today. So the first thing I want to ask is, at the start of the BBC, there was Lord Reith, the founder, or the man that was given the job of creating it, and the exact quote I'm not sure, but I think he said something like, you can trust the BBC not to be impartial on the serious issues, or words to that effect. How much do you think that has coloured, the history of the BBC, that mentality?
Well, I think that's, with a number of small honourable exceptions, that's been the guiding philosophy of the BBC ever since. He made that statement in a note in his diary where during the general strike the government was deciding whether it should take over the BBC to become an arm of government, and the cabinet decided not to do that. And Reith put in his diary, the cabinet decision is really a negative one. they know they can trust us not to be really impartial. And that was on the general strike, and ever since, when there's been controversy, BBC have exhibited a similar kind of attitude, which alternates between saying we are editorially independent and having quiet discussions and gentlemen's agreements with government. And you can see that all the way through colonial wars of the post-war period, and you can see that in the Falklands campaign, and you can see that in Iraq in 1991 and again in 2003. Suez may be slightly different as an example, but mostly the response to great power is to say we're an independent organisation, but then to accommodate to the power of the government, to make sure that they don't put on people who are too critical, make sure that the voices which are too critical are not heard in the mainstream of BBC television and radio.
If you said, okay, with a couple of notable exceptions, if a problem begins to come up, what levers of control do the government have over the BBC?
Well, the first lever of control which governments have is that most of the news every day is supplied by government press officers. So most of the sources that are used by journalists most of the time come from government departments. It doesn't matter what the issue is, that's always the way. Now, of course, those sources are supplemented by other sources, from corporations, sometimes from activist groups. But the vast bulk of news, the news agenda every day, is driven by the government. So that's the first means of control, and that's even without the question of spin on top. That's the sheer bulk of government news output, coupled with, of course, with the attempts to control that, which have varied and changed over the years through Bernard Ingham under Thatcher, to Alistair Campbell, and then Dave Hill under New Labour. So you have that process of information supply and spin control. And another thing then, that the second thing which allows government to control or influence the media is, of course, the process of what's called flak in Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model book. That's when people in power attempt to bully or intimidate or manage the news by complaining. And anyone who's seen Peter Capaldi's fantastic performance in the thick of it will know what that process of flak is about. It's about abuse and intimidation, attempts to manipulate and lie and make sure that the media will do what you want them to do, even if it's completely different to what you wanted them to do 5 minutes ago. So that's a process, and that process starts at the level of the spin doctors who will get on to the broadcasters and complain and belittle them if they don't do what they're told, and it moves up and escalates depending on the issue to ministers contacting the BBC hierarchy directly, civil servants, Prime Minister sometimes directly contacting the Director General or the governors of the BBC, and there are any number of cases of that in the period since the beginning of the 1970s, where you had an escalating process of attempts to manage, for example, the BBC, culminating really in the imposition of direct censorship on the BBC in 1988, broadcasting ban on Sinn Féin. But in the period running up to that, you had a number of different controversies, mostly over Ireland, the coverage of Ireland, and the question of state actions in Ireland, and torture and state killings, which led to a number of different programmes on current affairs and television and radio being banned or censored or delayed, culminating in the first big controversy when Thatcher came to power over the interview with a member of the INLA, where Thatcher intervened, and the attempt was to simply remove all voices critical of British policy in Ireland from the screens. And that process of dispute with the Thatcher government became much more severe through the 80s. You had the controversy over the Zircon programme in 1986, where the special branch unprecedentedly raided the headquarters of BBC Scotland and removed all the material in relation to the programme, although of course the programme had broken no laws and was based entirely on open source material. Nevertheless, the government felt able and confident enough to actually send the police in to raid BBC Scotland. And so you had a process of escalation, of open confrontation between the broadcasters and the state in that period in the 1980s. And the reason for that was because the BBC rests on a consensus notion of what reporting should be about. So the notion it's a value-based notion, but it's a notion that the democratic views of a range of democratic views should be expressed on the BBC, that the BBC is there to serve the public, to express and give a channel for those views. But the views it thinks it should be giving a voice to are those which encompass the range of opinions in the House of Commons minus the left and the far right of the House of Commons. So a kind of consensual view, which during the post-war period it made sense to to reflect. But when you have a radical right government like the Thatcher government coming in, the idea of giving any airtime to the left seemed to them to be somehow subversive, and so you had the BBC intrinsically on a collision course with the Thatcher government, and that escalated throughout the 1980s, escalating through the use of spin, through the use of flak, and attempts to manage and manipulate how the BBC reported things, as I said, culminating in the 1988 broadcasting ban. But then you have the process moving from the Thatcher years through to the current period, where the process put in place by Thatcher, the beginnings of the commercialisation of the broadcasting system, which again undermines the possibility of independent journalism, taken forward by Labour, who create Ofcom as a kind of privatised regulator for the broadcasters, particularly including the BBC. And of course you have the convulsion in the BBC, biggest convulsion in the BBC for a generation after the Iraq invasion.
Well, the thing there was one of the journalists said, I can't remember his name, but one of the BBC journalists said, investigative journalism at the BBC is not dead, but investigative journalism into the British government is dead. I can't remember which journalist that was. But the way you're saying, do you think that process was already, completed long before the Iraq thing, or do you think it's worse now than it was then?
Not completed. I mean, the BBC, it's not just an universal process. It depends. It depends on the unity of the state. It depends on whether when the Tory government fell apart over Europe in 1989-90, then it became much more possible for critical voices to get on television, because part of the Conservative Party was tearing itself apart. So you obviously have those kind of critical voices, and you have others critical of those voices themselves, from the left or from wherever. So it's not one directional process. It depends on the unity of the state. Depends on the extent. To some extent, depends on the extent of dissent in the country. You can see that in Iraq, reflected in a small way. Maybe come back to that, but the process of destroying investigative journalism was one which was well advanced by Thatcher. But under the Labour Party, the convulsion of Iraq really meant it was impossible to do proper news reporting, never mind investigative journalism. So although investigative journalism had largely disappeared by the time Labour came to power, that process has continued under Labour. No longer do you have serious regular current affairs programmes in prime time. You put current affairs programmes back in prime time, but most of them are not serious anymore. They tend to adopt a kind of reality TV approach to journalism, which doesn't best serve the ability to speak truth to power or hold power to account. So you have that process of destroying investigative journalism, and then you have the process of undermining even the possibility of properly reporting the news. So you have Andrew Gilligan, who according to some accounts made a mistake in what he reported, in the sense that he couldn't prove what he said, although of course what he said was true, as we now know, which is to do with the government knowing that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They did know there weren't any. They managed to manipulate the intelligence. This was not an intelligence failure. Intelligence people were telling them what was happening there, and they deliberately ignored and manipulated it, with the connivance, it has to be said, of many of the people in the intelligence services. Now, that process where Gilligan makes that report, David Kelly commits suicide, there's an inquiry, the Hutton inquiry, which is a whitewash, and you have the dismissal of the two most senior people in the BBC, which really tops what Thatcher was able to do, who didn't manage to dismiss the two most senior people, only the most senior person in the BBC. And you have, of course, the way in which government then is able to put pressure on broadcasters. In the case we're talking about directly, as I mentioned, by the process of flak, but also, and this is perhaps another way in which government influences the BBC, but also through the governors of the BBC. The government appoints the governors, and historically, in a crisis, they tend to be somewhat more on the government side than on the side of investigative journalism. Quite often, in fact, usually there's a former intelligence officer on the board of governors. There used to be a woman called Daphne Park. Then it became a woman called Polly Neville-Jones, who was the woman who particularly stuck life into Greg Dyke as the Director General. Her role in intelligence services and in military companies like Kinetic indicates the way in which those kinds of agendas can feed into the process. So the Board of Governors and now the BBC Trust are one means for what we can broadly call the ruling class to exert control over the broadcasters, in case they think that pursuing journalistic ends should be the only criteria for what they report or not. So that's a third way in which they can control what happens. And that regulatory process doesn't just involve committees of the great and good who oversee the broadcasters. Committees of essentially representatives of the ruling class. It's also done through question of regulation. I mentioned Ofcom a minute